Hello, I'm Esther Gidui Ewart. It's Tuesday, April 25th. This is Africa 54. More Sudanese flee Khartoum and foreign countries rush in to evacuate citizens as fighting in Sudan eases overnight after the warring sides agree to a 3-day truce. U.S. President Joe Biden officially launches his re-election campaign, appealing to voters in a video to grant him more time to finish the job his administration began 2 years ago. We'll hear more from VOA White House Bureau Chief. And the small town of Frankfort, South Africa faces renewed power outages after a court ruled against the town's use of an independent solar electricity producer. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. A U.S. brokered 3-day ceasefire between Sudan's warring generals appears to be holding despite sporadic clashes after previous ceasefires quickly failed. Residents in Khartoum are using the lull in the fighting to restock supplies or to evacuate the capital. Fighting in Sudan eased overnight after the army and a rival paramilitary force agreed to the 3-day truce, allowing more Sudanese to flee on Tuesday and foreign countries to extract citizens. At least 459 people have been killed in the fighting and over 4,000 have been wounded. Water, power and food supplies have been severely limited due to the fighting. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Sudan says 700 UN and international non-governmental organization staffers and their dependents have reached Port Sudan by road. More than 70 other international aid workers have already been evacuated from El Geneina in West Darfur and Zalingay in Central Darfur to Chad. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that following intense negotiations, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces agreed to a nationwide ceasefire that started at midnight local time on Monday and is set to last for 72 hours. VOA senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has more.
A UN convoy carrying 700 people completed a dangerous 850-kilometer trip from the embattled capital Khartoum to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast, as foreign countries and organizations continued to extricate their personnel from the violence between the two warring factions in Sudan. On Saturday, the U.S. military sent 3 Chinook helicopters to evacuate the American embassy staff from Khartoum. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed gratitude.
We are proud of the extraordinary commitment of our embassy staff, who perform their duties with courage and professionalism, and we are grateful for the unmatched skill of our service members who successfully brought them to safety. We thank Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia, each of which were critical to the success of our operation.
At the State Department, VOA asked Secretary Blinken how many Americans remain in Sudan and what their options are. Blinken said exact numbers are not available, and the U.S. is trying to help private U.S. citizens join convoys organized by other countries.
We do know, of course, the number of Americans who have registered with us and with whom we're in very active communication. And of those, I would say some dozens have expressed an interest in leaving.
Asked about foreign intervention in the fighting in Sudan, Blinken had this to say about Russia's Wagner Group mercenaries.
We do have deep concern about the engagement of the Prigozhin group, the Wagner Group, in Sudan. It's in so many different countries in Africa, an element that, when it's engaged, simply brings more death and destruction with it, It's very important that we not see its further engagement in Sudan, and I know a number of countries are very concerned with that prospect.
One analyst told VOA that the Russian-based and supported Wagner Group is reportedly now providing Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, paramilitary force, with weapons, and said this could be a game changer.
We understand that they may have provided man-portable air defense systems, shoulder-fired rockets, tank busters, things like that, to try to hit at the Sudan Armed Forces heavy armor. If that were true, and if they were to introduce those into the fight, that could help to turn the tide in favor of the RSF.
Hudson told VOA that Egypt is openly supporting the other side in the conflict, Sudan's armed forces.
They don't hide the fact that they're interested in seeing the army maintain control over the country. They've never been particularly interested in seeing a civilian transition there.
Kenyan Foreign Minister Alfred Mutua called on the Wagner Group and all foreign powers to stop providing weapons and stoking the conflict, blaming countries in the Middle East without naming names. He also said Kenya has offered to mediate in the conflict between the two warring generals and is optimistic an agreement can be reached to end the suffering of Sudanese civilians. Cindy Sain, VOA News, the State Department.
For more on humanitarian assistance for those caught in the Sudanese conflict, I'm joined live via Skype from here in Washington by Fred McRae, Senior Director for Humanitarian Assistance at Chorus International and former World Vision Country Director for South Sudan. Fred, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you.
What, in your opinion, is the most critical concern right now for those fleeing Sudan and those who have no option but to remain in the country?
Well, there needs to be a durable ceasefire that would allow humanitarian operations to take place and be carried out. Even before this current crisis, Sudan was a very poor country with high rates of food insecurity throughout the country. This current crisis has only compounded that problem and exacerbated the need for the delivery of food assistance, clean water, and access to medical care. A number of hospitals and health facilities have been destroyed and attacked and no longer are functioning, which means that thousands of people are not receiving critical medical care that they need. So a durable ceasefire is the first step to allow humanitarian operations to recommence.
You know, Fred, even prior to this conflict, Sudan was a home to thousands of refugees from neighboring countries. Our humanitarian organizations on the ground, ensuring that these refugees stay safe, they have water, they have food, and medical services as well.
Yes, Sudan. Has been home to a number of refugees itself. With this current crisis, we're seeing large numbers of people being displaced to either to safer parts of the country or to neighboring countries. You know, as you mentioned, I worked in South Sudan for several years, and I know how porous that border can be between the two countries. So you will see large numbers of people moving. Of course, the danger is that with this type of displacement, it makes people especially vulnerable. There's an increased risk of families being separated, of children being separated from their parents. And at times like this, the elderly and disabled are the most vulnerable.
Fred, we understand that some of the humanitarian organizations are also leaving because they fear their lives are in danger. But how do humanitarian organizations typically coordinate, you know, what they are doing so that you don't duplicate and you're able to cover the country where people are in need?
We work very hard to coordinate amongst ourselves as international non-governmental organizations, local non-governmental organizations, and then our UN counterparts. So we share information extensively in terms of what programs we're operating across the country to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts and to make sure that communities receive a full range of services that they may need.
Well, Fred, you know, we hope for the best and keep us updated on what's happening and how these very desperate people are being assisted. Fred McRae is Senior Director for Humanitarian Assistance at Chorus International and former World Vision Country Director for South Sudan. Sudan is being dragged to the brink of civil war by a power struggle between two men, a career soldier and a former warlord who rose to power under former autocratic leader Omar al-Bashir. David Doyle has more.
Once side by side, two men now stand opposed in a battle that is dragging Sudan to the brink of civil war. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is the de facto head of state, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo his deputy. The former is a career soldier and the army's chief, the latter better known as Hemeti, a former warlord who leads the country's main paramilitary group.
I am a simple Bedouin man who grew up on the sidelines of Sudan. Didn't get anything from my country except violence.
Hemeti started out as a camel trader in the Darfur region, before, according to a former assistant, taking up arms after his trade convoy was attacked. He was among fighters who later allied with the government to quash a rebellion that erupted in Darfur in 2003. The militia forces had a fearsome reputation. They became known as the Janjaweed, a term loosely derived from the Arabic for devils on horseback. Around 300,000 people were killed in the Darfur campaign, and 2 million displaced. The International Criminal Court has accused former President Omar al-Bashir of masterminding genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, which he and his government denied, saying that they only targeted rebels. Amid the bloodshed, Hemeti caught Bashir's attention. His militia, which morphed into the Rapid Support Forces, became the government's enforcer. Bashir gave Hemeti's family and associates free rein to sell Sudan's gold, helping him amass a fortune. But Hemeti would later turn on his benefactor when Bashir was ousted in 2019. He secured the post of deputy head of state, technically reporting to Burhan, who cuts a very different figure. He's a career soldier with 41 years of service, mostly under Bashir. Like Hemeti, Burhan also rose under the autocratic leader before dumping him when Bashir's star was waning. Burhan says he was one of the military figures who told Bashir to step down. Since then, as the head of a military council, Burhan has made promises of elections and handing over power to a civilian government. His opponents say he's instead put the military firmly in charge. Protests have faced a fierce response from Burhan's security forces.
Once we put on these khakis, we have no other path. We do not get startled or afraid. And even if every one of us is dead, we will not be frightened or back away.
As military chief, Burhan controls heavy weapons and the armed forces. But his soldiers are up against Hemeti's skilled irregular force that may number, analysts say, 100,000 or more paramilitary fighters. They have already proved a tricky opponent. When bases have come under attack, they have melted away into residential areas, where heavy armor and conventional military tactics lose their advantage. Both men now battle, predominantly in the capital, trying to deliver the killer blow in their power struggle. Instead, they may deliver a protracted conflict and more instability. After decades of autocracy, military rule and international isolation, Sudan is in danger of seeing its prospects for peace and economic revival go up in smoke.
David Doyle of Reuters filed that report. U.S. President Joe Biden officially launched his re-election campaign Tuesday, appealing to voters in a video to grant him time to finish the job his administration began 2 years ago. For more on President Biden's re-elected bid, let's go to the White House, where VOA White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara is standing by. Hello, Patsy. What stands out for you from this announcement?
What really jumps out to me from this announcement, Esther, is the fact that President Biden is returning to the theme that he ran on in 2020, which is the battle for the soul of America. So essentially what he's saying right now is that he, Joe Biden, needs 4 more years to continue to finish the job, both in terms of governing as well as saving the nation from what he says is the biggest threat, which is Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, who, as we know, is running again, and the ideology of Trumpism. We can see from the video announcement that he is putting forward the Republican candidates, both Donald Trump as well as Ron DeSantis. These are the 2 key figures that's likely to run in 2024 against him. So what does this tell us? This tells us that he is going to be running on ideology, on these so-called culture war issues, abortion, LGBTQ rights, immigration, and so on, but also on the bread and butter issues, in highlighting his achievements, including returning manufacturing to the U.S., creating jobs, as well as a number of other legislative achievements. So we may yet see again another run between President Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2024.
And so where's Biden in terms of the polls, and are there other Democratic candidates likely to say, well, I'm also going to run for president?
Yeah, so the polls right now is not great for Joe Biden. He's been polling in the upper 30s, low 40s for months right now, and we have yet to see how this announcement is going to impact his standing in the polls. As far as the other candidates from the Democratic side, there's really nobody strong enough to speak of. There are 2 people who have said that they are running against Joe Biden: Marianne Williamson, this is a self-help guru, and Robert Kennedy Jr., the nephew of former President J.F. Kennedy. But so far, none of these figures can even amount to any kind of real or meaningful challenge to Biden.
You mentioned that, he's not doing very well in the polls. But again, if you look at former President Donald Trump, he's also kind of in a conflict of a situation where we don't know if the Republicans are going to say yes to him, because he is facing a couple of legal challenges. What are you learning from analysts on that?
Yeah, so at this point in April, which is 9 months before the first primary in February, it looks very likely that either that both Joe Biden will be the nominee from the Democratic side and Donald Trump may be the likely nominee from the Republican side. And this is such an interesting situation because we see poll after poll showing that Americans do not want to see a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Most Americans do not want Joe Biden to run again, including about 50% of Democrats, and half of them cite his age as a factor. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, it's the same case. They want somebody else other than Donald Trump. Having said that, if there is a rematch between Biden and Trump, most Americans will say that they will vote for their guy, which essentially shows you that even though there's lack of enthusiasm to choose again between Biden and Trump, they will still choose their guy because the alternative is even more distasteful to them.
Patsy, they say one day in politics can change everything. So thank you so much, Patsy. VOA Patsy Widakuswara reporting live for us from the White House. Still to come, a South Africa town faces renewed power outages. We'll explain after the break.
From around the world, let's go.
In other news, the International Monetary Fund has approved the first review of Tanzania's 3-year extended credit request, allowing immediate disbursement of about $153 million in budgetary support. The United Nations has announced that Guinea-Bissau is the first country outside of Europe to join an international agreement on government accountability, human rights, and the environment. And President Cyril Ramaphosa says his ruling African Nation Congress party has determined that South Africa should quit the International Criminal Court. Ramaphosa says the decision was reached largely because of what is perceived as the court's unfair treatment of certain countries. A small town in South Africa is facing renewed power outages after a court ruled against its use of an independent solar electricity producer instead of the national utility Eskom. Jan Bornman reports.
Once side by side, two men now stand opposed in a battle that is dragging Sudan to the brink of civil war. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is the de facto head of state, General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo his deputy. The former is a career soldier and the army's chief. The latter, better known as Hemeti, a former warlord who leads the country's main paramilitary group.
I am a simple Bedouin man who grew up on the sidelines of Sudan. Didn't get anything from my country except violence.
Hemeti started out as a camel trader in the Darfur region, before, according to a former assistant, taking up arms after his trade convoy was attacked. He was among fighters who later allied with the government to quash a rebellion that erupted in Darfur in 2003. The militia forces had a fearsome reputation. They became known as the Janjaweed, a term loosely derived from the Arabic for devils on horseback. Around 300,000 people were killed in the Darfur campaign, and 2 million displaced. The International Criminal Court has accused former President Omar al-Bashir of masterminding genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, which he and his government denied, saying that they only targeted rebels. Amid the bloodshed, Hemeti caught Bashir's attention. His militia...
Apologies for that. Now to our health report. The World Health Organization says maternal health refers to the health of women during pregnancy, childbirth and postnatal period. Every pregnancy and birth is unique according to World Health Organization. VOS Mkamiti Kibayasi is here with more.
Thanks, Esther. One of most common early signs of pregnancy is missed menstrual cycle. Doctors say most pregnancies last for about 280 days, which is somewhere around 40 weeks. To learn more about pregnancy stages, do's and don'ts, Dr. George Guako, gynecologist at Precise Healthcare, joins me live via Skype from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Dr. Guako.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. What should expectant mothers avoid in the first 13 weeks of pregnancy?
Thank you for the question. There are quite a number of things that pregnant women are supposed to avoid. So the first thing is exposure to drugs. That's over-the-counter drugs, things like cocaine, cigarette smoking, alcohol, and exposure to radiation, among other things. But those would be the key things that pregnant women are supposed to avoid.
Tell us about genetic tests for pregnant women and why this is important.
Thank you again for the question. So ordinarily, all pregnant women in the first trimester, as you had said, will be subjected to a number of tests that we call antenatal profiles. These include a hemogram to check for anemia. We screen for hepatitis B, syphilis, HIV, diabetes, and we do a urinalysis during each visit to rule out urinary tract infections, which are very common, preeclampsia and diabetes. Now, for genetic testing, it's usually reserved for a specific number of patients especially those ones where you suspect they might be predisposed to getting conditions like Down syndrome if somebody is above age of 35, people with recurrent pregnancy losses, or patients with recurrent conditions like preeclampsia. So those ones will require additional tests on top of the ones that I just mentioned.
Should pregnant women be vaccinated, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of getting these shots?
Thank you again for the question. So there are quite a number of vaccines that are recommended during pregnancy, but 3 of them are very key. So the first one is the tetanus toxoid, which prevents pregnant women from getting tetanus, and also it protects their babies after delivery from getting tetanus. It's still common in especially low and middle income countries. The second vaccine that you ordinarily give is the flu vaccine, especially if, like in the tropics, if somebody will be pregnant around the flu season, which is around March to June. The third common vaccine that we are ordinarily starting to give is the COVID-19 booster vaccines. And this has been, it's something that has been brought into the fore, given the fact that studies showed that pregnant women are likely to have adverse perinatal outcomes if they get COVID-19 vaccine. So those will be the 3 common ones that we give.
And at what point do doctors decide a pregnant woman needs a C-section and not a normal delivery?
Thank you again for the question. So when pregnant ladies come to us antenatally, so one of the things we do is to have a delivery plan for them from the first visit. It's good to note that about 85% of women will have a normal delivery, about 15% will require cesarean section. Cesarean sections are of 2 types. They are the emergency cesarean deliveries and then elective cesarean deliveries. Emergency cesarean deliveries are the most common. The unfortunate thing is that most of those ones will not be able to anticipate. You wait for somebody to go into labor, maybe labor doesn't progress or the baby develops distress, then they require an emergency CS. For the elective ones, those are the ones we do before somebody goes into labor. The indications are few. Probably somebody has had more than 2 cesarean deliveries and multiple uterine surgeries, for example, for uterine fibroids. What I'm trying to say is basically most of the times you will not be able to determine who is going to have a cesarean delivery and who is going to have a normal birth. But the odds are 85% for normal delivery versus 15%.
Thanks, Dr. Gwako. Dr. Gwako is gynecologist at Precise Healthcare and lecturer at University of Nairobi. Back to you, Esther.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much, Mkamiti. Be sure to watch Africa 54's health reports right here on Africa 54. And thank you, viewers, for joining us on Africa 54. See you tomorrow.